think we're talking past each other. I think we're villainizing one another. I think we're often being mean-spirited toward one another. And I think it's not going to work out well for any of us if we continue on this particular path. Then there is no air. Then your system, oh, look at that deer. Yeah. Did you see that? I'm not one who typically makes New Year's resolutions, and I don't know that this year is any exception. However, there is something about the holiday period between Christmas and New Year's where things are just of a different pace, and sometimes different ideas come to you during this time. I had this thought dawn on me this morning. Actually, it's pretty compelling, and I wanted to work through that in this video. And that's this idea that there might actually be a better way of doing our political discourse. That is, what we're doing right now doesn't seem to be working for the most part. I'm sure there's some areas where our political discourse is working well, but in my estimation, it is pretty bad and maybe even at an all-time low. I say this probably at least in part because I opened a Twitter account recently. As of recording this, I have exactly 7 followers, so I am crushing it on Twitter. So check that out and follow me if you'd like. You can maybe be the 8th follower of mine. And I noticed something about Twitter, and I really don't know much about it and hadn't really paid much attention to it. Although I realize my first impressions are similar to what I've heard other people say, in that it is at once fun, addictive, maybe useful at times, and also a dumpster fire that tends to bring out the worst in each of us. And somehow it's all those things. And again, I'm just dipping my toe into it. But it got me thinking about just how we tend to talk past each other in politics. And I have some ideas as to maybe what we could do differently, or what some of us can do differently to lessen that effect, I suppose. And I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to share a little bit of a story or scenario, I guess, that I found myself in. Nothing particularly earth-shattering, but it made me sort of think of political discourse. So I was up north over the holidays with my wife in northern Ontario, and we were driving down an Ontario highway, but a rural Ontario highway. This is sort of between Sudbury and North Bay, if you know the area. And it was actually conditions kind of like this. It was relatively mild, it was daytime, and I noticed that there was a pickup truck on the side of the road, like a compact pickup truck, and it looked like, well, it didn't look like, the front wheel was off. I think they had the vehicle jacked up, and they were presumably in the process of changing a tire. Anyway, it dawned on me, should I stop and see if I can lend some assistance? Now, in this case, I didn't stop. That's sort of beside the point. And it got me thinking about a question that we could ask ourselves, like a general one. Should one stop to lend aid to someone in that type of situation? And it dawned on me that there's no absolute correct answer to that exactly. I think most of us would agree that everything else being equal, and a key thing here is that everything is not equal, and I'll get to that in a minute, but everything being equal, I think most of us would want to live in a society where people do stop to lend a hand to other people. At the same time, there's some inherent risk in doing something like that. You just have to see some movies or television shows to know that not everyone out there is a good person, and some people might actually take advantage of your willingness to stop and help. So there's sort of 2 ways we can get that wrong. Now, again, if there's a legitimate citizen who needs our help, we want to be able to offer that help. So we can imagine this, and I think this comes down to what they call a Category 1 and a Category 2 error. And I might have some of the language wrong, or I might get that backwards, but I think that's what they call it. So if you imagine you have a set of parameters in your mind as to when you might stop and when you might not stop, like under what conditions. And maybe if it's day or night, or if you're with someone, or how far away you are from a town, or whether there's cell phone service. All these things might factor in. But anyway, there's two ways you can get that right and two ways you can get it wrong. And if you can imagine like a 2x2 grid or matrix where either the person who ostensibly needs your help is a good guy or a bad guy. Of course, there's different degrees of that, but for this illustration, let's just assume they're either good or bad. And you're either going to stop or not stop. So on the other axis, you can have stop and not stop. So if they are a good guy, so to speak, and you stop to lend help, then there is no error. Then your system, oh, look at that deer. Not sure if you can see that. Yeah. Did you see that? I almost ran right over here and then realized I was here. Anyway, that's kind of cool. Where was I? So you can stop or not stop. So yeah, if you stop and they're a good guy, it means your little algorithm that you do worked out that time. Similarly, if they are a bad guy and you choose not to stop, and of course you never know really if they're a good guy or a bad guy until you get out to kind of help them. So if you decide to not stop and it turns out they're a bad guy, that's also success for your little algorithm. The other two categories are technically errors, but they're different types of errors. So when you assume someone might be good, hi dear, but they're bad, then that is really not so good. Where are they? Can you see them? I'll get out of the way here. Oh dear. It's okay. And they're off. Okay. Deer interruptions. It's unusual to be interrupted by deer. So they're either good or they're bad, and you either get that kind of right or wrong. Okay, so the errors are you assume them to be bad, and it turns out they were good. So you drive on by, but they could have legitimately used your help. Or, I guess the worst error is you stop to help, and it turns out they're a bad guy. Now, of course, there's different probabilities of getting those different errors, but I'm going to put that aside for our discussion here. But what's important to note in this is this algorithm, no matter what your personal thoughts are on whether you stop or not, I think the vast majority of us, maybe there's a small minority, but I think most of us would admit that there's certain circumstances under which we would not stop, and other ones where we would almost certainly stop if the conditions were right. Did you see the deer?
We did.
Yeah.
So did he.
Yeah, I think maybe they were running from the dog and they almost ran right to where I was.
Yeah,
Which was kind of
they
fun,
went right through. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was crazy.
That was neat.
Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. So there's different probabilities. I leave that aside, and different consequences for getting it wrong. But there's a benefit to society when we help people, and there's definitely a cost for ourselves if we try to help someone who is, quote unquote, a bad guy. And again, so it's not really practical for us to have some sort of rule under which we stop under no circumstances, or under which we stop at every circumstance. Like we each have our own measure. Now, no matter how we kind of dial in those risks, we are going to expose ourselves to one and likely both of those potential errors. That is to say, there's no setting on that dial that we can dial in where we can be quite sure that we will make neither error. Either we're going to stop to help people we think are good guys and turn out to be bad guys part of the time, or we're going to miss the opportunity to help someone who's actually in need. And that's where it comes down to political discourse. So let me explain. I think there's, and I don't, so I want to get the abstract idea out there first, and then maybe we can fill it in with some particulars in the news. So using this sort of roadside example, political party A maybe says, there's people that might be in need, so we have to do everything we can to make sure we always stop to help them. And then party B says, no, sometimes the people that look like they need help are actually bad guys and can cause us harm. Therefore, we must never stop and help people. Of course, those two extremes, sort of by their nature, are kind of wrong. In most things, now there might be some exceptions, but in most things there's a trade-off where, like the real-life example of stopping to help someone in the car, where we assume some risk, some of the time, some of us, in order to provide some kind of benefit to society. I know I've been helped at the side of the road and I've really appreciated it, and I want to return that to my fellow citizen, where I can, when I can, and when I think the risk is relatively low. So that doesn't mean I'll do it all the time, of course. So I'd say most questions in our political conversations are similar to this: should we stop, should we not stop, or under what conditions should we stop, under what conditions should we not stop? Not absolute, we must never or we must always. And spending some time on Twitter, I realized that, and part of this is the platform and all kinds of other things, that there is a tendency for people's reasoning on both political sides, frankly, where their argument is tantamount to we must never do X or we must always do X. So I want to use a real life example. This is something from the news that came up recently, a tragic story actually. And I want to kind of talk about this dynamic and not so much the particulars. So you probably have strong feelings about this particular incident. I have strong feelings, frankly. But try not to get caught up in the particulars, and let's talk about the dynamics, or how we can have a fruitful discussion about this particular topic. So many of you probably know by now that an OPP officer was shot and killed doing a roadside stop. Didn't really see that connection exactly till right now, but stopping to investigate a vehicle in a ditch, I believe. And the person who is accused of shooting and killing that police officer apparently had been charged with other crimes, but was released on bail. So now the discussion is, do we need to reform our bail policy in Canada? So using this as a real life example, there are two opposite errors we can make, we collectively on either political side. We could take the stance, as some people have. Now, I should qualify things, like Twitter is not real life exactly. People need to say things that are short and concise and pithy and evocative of emotion, so it's not really a full argument. But there's some people that appear to be saying something along the lines of, the fact that even one police officer was killed shows that our bail system is broken. It errs on the side, it's making one type of error. It's erring on the side of letting people out on bail who ought to be remanded instead. And those people might argue that, if there's even one officer that this happens to, that's too many. And then let's talk about the problem with that line of argumentation exactly. The only way that I see it to be absolutely sure that we never have this happen again is we never let anyone out on bail ever again for any reason. That would solve that problem. But of course it brings up other problems, that there is trade-offs. I guess that's the point in all of this, that all these things boil down to trade-offs. What are you willing to be less ideal in order for this thing to be more ideal? Now the other side of that bail conversation is something that, and I've seen the CBC not quite argue for this, but sort of tacitly point in this direction. And it says, I think their argument is generally, the bail system's complicated, there's much smarter people who know about these things, and all these right-wing people who say we need to fix it, don't understand the nuances of the system. And what's interesting is, it's probably true, I'll speak for myself, I don't know the system very well at all. I don't have any real first-hand knowledge of how that works exactly. I have some idea based on television and popular culture, but admittedly I don't really know. But what's interesting is that's not an argument not to think about our bail policies, basically, or the way we do that. So again, I think maybe on the other side of that argument, people might be saying, well, it is so tragic if someone is denied bail and they have to stay locked up when technically they haven't even been found guilty of a crime. And I would agree that that is not something we want to maximize. So somehow and I don't want to use the word balance because it's strictly speaking not a balance. It's trade-offs. How do we manage the trade-offs where we have a system in place that is mostly good at keeping people in jail who need to be in jail, and mostly good at letting people out of jail while they wait their trial who are likely not to cause problems in society. And those are trade-offs. We can never get those perfect. Now, having said all that, with this particular matter, my sense is, and I could be wrong, is that our system has gone too far in making the one error at the expense of the other, and that has been too lax letting people out. Anyway, that's just my opinion, but I don't need to go on in that respect. The point is, there's these different category errors we can make. So what does all this mean for Twitter and for the new year? Well, I think if we change our discussion and it's harder, and it doesn't make for good tweets exactly, where we said things, I'll put the bail issue aside, where we said we need factor X in our society to be better. We need more freedom, or we need more regulation, or we need safer streets, or we need more economic freedom, or more environmental, whatever the particulars are, it doesn't matter, where we say we want more of this thing, and here are the other things that we're willing to sacrifice or to take less of. So, just by one example, for me personally, I am certainly willing to have a court system, not bail, but I'm talking about actual trials, that errs on the side, or errs on the side, I think is the verb, that errs on the side of finding people not guilty unless there's actually overwhelming evidence or beyond the shadow of a doubt, or whatever the actual terminology is. Even though technically that is going to increase the likelihood of letting people go who are guilty, but generally minimize, but not absolutely, none of these things go down to zero, but largely protects innocent people from being punished. So as a citizen, that's sort of where I kind of draw the line, but you could differ, and we can have those debates. But instead of saying there's only one factor and we need to maximize that factor or minimize that factor, we should have that discussion about trade-offs. And that, not to make everything about COVID, but this has been my problem with COVID and the vaccines and the mandates, is it's been a singular factor where we're only looking at perceived safety. And I think we kind of got that one wrong, even in isolation. And we couldn't even talk about what the trade-offs are. And everything has trade-offs. By doing one thing, it means you're not doing another thing. Anyway, for 2023, I'm thinking I want to develop these ideas as to what we can do differently to make for more fruitful political dialogue and discourse. I think it is important. I think we can all benefit from learning and developing skills to have those more fruitful discussions and to, I'll say, call people out. I'm not sure if that's the right word, on either side when they're making an argument that is too simplistic or that is taking only one factor in mind. Now, for that to work, I think we have to start with an open mind, be a little bit more nuanced. I want to recognize that even suggesting that we be a little bit more nuanced is itself a challenge, because being nuanced can be confused with having a anything goes attitude. Oh, it's all complicated, so there is no right and wrong. We can still, I think with this process, if we start with an open mind and we start with a wide array of potential answers, and then use our faculties of reason to narrow it down or to come to certain conclusions, we can still come to conclusions that are robust and firm and what am I trying to say? Yes, strong conclusions. So it doesn't mean not holding strong opinions. It means reserving those strong opinions for the conclusion phase. So we start with an open mind, and that we work from there and draw conclusions. I think when we have an open mind, it maybe encourages other people to have an open mind as well. Maybe that's naive optimism, I don't know, but I think we need to do something about our political discourse in this country and around the world. I think we're talking past each other. I think we're villainizing one another. I think we're often being mean-spirited toward one another. And I think it's not going to work out well for any of us if we continue on this particular path. Now, having said all that, I don't know that we need everyone to adopt this. I believe that individual decisions make a difference in the world. Yes, there's big forces, there's big government, there's big corporations, there's media, there's political camps, there's lobby groups, there's all these actors that have influence and power. I don't deny that. But I also believe that the individual, by the actions that he or she chooses and the disposition that he or she chooses in the moment, can have a real effect in the real world. Maybe in small ways, but real nonetheless. And there's something special about non-zero factors. So can a single person change everything? Perhaps not, but a single person can at least change his or her own outlook, has some effect on his or her own relationships. And who knows, if a few of us start doing that, having more honest dialogue, that maybe we'll gain something that other people don't get by staying dug in their camp. Anyway, if this appeals to you, let me know in the comments. I hope that 2023 is a good year for political discourse and for you individually as we hopefully get out of this lingering pandemic and COVID madness that has seized us these last few years. Thanks for watching, and we'll check in next time. Thanks.